right, so we have talked about skeletal muscle in depth, but we also need to talk a little bit about the other types of muscle, right? We know that there is also cardiac muscle in our bodies and smooth muscle. Both of these types are what we call involuntary, right? Because we don't have to think about making them move. So, cardiac muscle is limited to the heart where it functions to pump our blood. And there are some properties of cardiac muscle. And that is that there is a contraction with a regular rhythm, right? Which is our heartbeat. We know that our heart beats, hopefully, continuously throughout the day. And again, we don't think about that. The muscle cells of each chamber must contract in unison, right? Our heart functions as a single organ, and it works together. Contractions must last long enough to expel the blood from our vessels and from the atriums and the ventricles. Our cardiac muscle works whether we're asleep or we're awake, and hopefully without fail, and without that conscious attention, which is why it's involuntary. And hopefully our heart doesn't get tired, right? It is resistant to fatigue. The cardiac muscle cells are striated, very much like the skeletal muscles. But the myocytes are shorter and thicker. Each myocyte is joined to several others at the uneven, notched linkages that we call intercalated discs. These are the dark lines, the dark thick lines that we see when we look at a stained microscopic image of heart tissue. And there are also electrical gap junctions that allow each myocyte to directly stimulate its neighbors. There are mechanical junctions that keep the myocytes from pulling together. So again, it's all working as a unit. There is a sarcoplasmic reticulum within the cardiac muscle cells, but it is less developed. The T-tubules, however, are larger and emit supplemental calcium from the extracellular fluid. Damaged cardiac muscle cells can repair by fibrosis. So we have seen some mitosis actually going on after heart attacks, meaning that the cells are regenerating. It is not in a significant amount, and it doesn't end in a functional muscle, but it has been noted. So, our cardiac muscle can contract without the need for a nervous stimulation. And this is because we have a built-in pacemaker that rhythmically sets off a wave of electrical excitation. This wave travels through the muscle and triggers contraction of the heart chambers. It is what we say is autorhythmic because of its ability to contract rhythmically and independently. The autonomic nervous system does send nerve fibers to the heart, and this can increase or decrease your heart rate and the contraction of strength. And this depends on what you're doing and your activity level. There are very slow twitches that does not exhibit quick twitches like skeletal muscle. Our heart functions different than our skeletal muscle. It maintains a tension for about 200 to 250 milliseconds, and this gives the heart enough time to expel the blood. It uses aerobic respiration almost exclusively because the muscle cells are rich in myoglobin and glycogen, and they have especially large mitochondria. Cardiac muscle is very adaptable with respect to the fuel that it uses, and it is very vulnerable to interruptions of oxygen supply, right? We need to continually breathe and supply our heart with that oxygen. And as we mentioned, it is highly fatigue resistant. Hopefully, it just keeps going, right? Then you have smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is composed of myocytes that have a physiform shape. There is only one nucleus located near the middle of the cell, and there are no visible striations. That's why it's called smooth muscle. There are thick and thin filaments, but they are not aligned with each other, so they don't appear in that striated form that we see in the skeletal muscle. The Z discs are absent and replaced with dense bodies. And these are well-ordered arrays of protein masses in the cytoplasm. There are also protein plaques on the interface of the plasma membrane. The cytoplasm contains extensive cytoskeleton of intermediate filament. And these attach to the membrane plaques and the dense bodies. They provide mechanical linkages between the thin myofilaments and the plasma membrane. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is scanty, and there are no T tubules. Calcium is needed for muscle contraction, and it comes from the extracellular fluid by way of calcium channels in the sarcolemma, which is the plasma membrane. Some smooth muscles lack nerve supply, while others receive autonomic fibers, not somatic motor fibers as we see in skeletal muscle. They are capable of mitosis and hyperplasia, and if they are injured, they can regenerate as well. There are two types of smooth muscle. The first one is what we call a multi-unit. This occurs in some of the largest arteries and the pulmonary air passages, in the piloerector muscles of the hair follicle, and in the iris of the eye. The autonomic innervation is similar to that of skeletal muscle. There are terminal branches of a nerve fiber synapse with individual myocytes and a form of motor unit. Each motor unit contracts independently of the others. There are also single unit smooth muscle cells. They are more widespread. They occur in most of our blood vessels, in the digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts, and they are sometimes called visceral muscle. And they often occur in two layers, the inner circular and the outer longitudinal. Myocytes of this cell type are electrically coupled to each other by gap junctions. They directly stimulate each other, and a large number of cells contract as a single unit, hence their name. So how is smooth muscle cells stimulated? As we said, it is involuntary and it can contract without nervous stimulation. It can contract in response to chemical stimuli, such as hormones, carbon dioxide, a lowering of your pH, or an oxygen deficiency. It can respond to stretching. Single unit smooth muscle in your stomach and intestines has pacemaker cells that set off waves of contraction throughout the entire layer of the muscle, because our stomach and our intestines are constantly contracting, right, to digest our food. Most smooth muscle is innervated by autonomic nerve fibers, and these can trigger and modify contractions. They stimulate smooth muscle with either acetylcholine or norepinephrine, and they can have contrasting effects, meaning they can relax or contract the smooth muscles, depending on the function that is needed. In a single unit of smooth muscle, each autonomic nerve fibers has up to 20,000 bead-like swellings called varicosities. Each of these contains synaptic vesicles and a few mitochondria. The nerve fiber passes amid several myocytes and stimulates all of them at once when it releases its neurotransmitter. There are no motor end plates, but receptors scattered throughout the surface, diffuse junctions, and there are no one-to-one relationship between nerve fiber and myocyte. Contraction and relaxation. Contraction is triggered by calcium, energized ATP, and is achieved by sliding thin past thick filaments. Contraction begins in response to calcium that enters the cell from the ECF, a little internally from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. There are voltage, ligand, and mechanically gated channels, calcium channels, that open to allow calcium to enter the cell. The calcium binds to calmodulin on the thick filaments, and therefore there is an activation of the myosin light chain kinase, which adds phosphate to regulatory protein on the myosin head. Right? Then we have the myosin ATPase hydrolyzing ATP. This enables the myosin's similar power and recovery strokes that we see in the skeletal muscle. So here we're seeing kind of how these thick and thin filaments pull by one another and cause contraction. So we see a force that is transferred to the plasma membrane and the entire cell shortens. And it's kind of as if you could see someone wringing out a wet towel, where it kind of puckers and twists and kind of contracts within that motion. But the contraction and the relaxation are very slow in comparison to the skeletal muscle. The latent period in a skeletal muscle is only 2 milliseconds, whereas in smooth muscle, it's 50 to 100 milliseconds. And the tension peaks at about 500 milliseconds. And then it declines over a period of 1 to 2 seconds, and it slowly, the myosin ATPase enzyme and the slow pumps then remove the calcium, just like we saw before, and but we do see calmodulin instead of troponin, which we heard about in the skeletal muscle, and this activates the kinases and the ATPases to then hydrolyze that ATP. There is what we call a latch bridge mechanism, and it is resistant to fatigue. And here we have the heads of the myosin molecules that do not attach from actin immediately. They then do not consume any more ATP, and this maintains a tetanus tonic contraction, or what we call smooth muscle tone. We see this in our arteries. And we see the ATP being made aerobically, needing oxygen. Your smooth muscle stretches. It contracts and it stretches. The stretch can open mechanically gated calcium channels in the sarcolemma, which then can also cause contraction. The way our food moves down our esophagus and into our colon is periostolous. And this is a contraction that is happening to move things basically down your esophagus, down your intestines, out your colon, and out of your body. And these are all muscle contractions that are happening within the smooth muscle. You can also have a stress relaxation response, a receptive relaxation, and this helps the hollow organs to gradually fill. We see this in our bladder. When stretched, the tissue briefly contracts, it then relaxes, and this helps prevent emptying when it's trying to fill. So, remember, skeletal muscle cannot contract forcefully if it's overstretched. Smooth muscle contracts forcefully even when greatly stretched, and this allows hollow organs such as the stomach and bladder to fill and then expel their contents efficiently. Smooth muscle can be anywhere from half to twice its resting length and still contract very powerfully. And there are 3 reasons for this. First, there are no Z-discs, so the thick filaments cannot butt up against them and therefore stop the contraction. Since the thick and thin filaments are not arranged in orderly sarcomeres, stretching does not cause a situation where there is too little overlap for the cross bridges to form. And thirdly, the thick filaments of smooth muscle have myosin heads along their entire length, so the cross bridges can form anywhere. There is also something called plasticity, and this is the ability to adjust its tension to the degree of stretch. A hollow organ, such as the bladder, can be greatly stretched, yet not become flabby when it is empty, because it has plasticity. And that brings us to a close of our lecture about cardiac and smooth muscle. I hope you enjoyed it.